So the study of different movements that we do on our field in respective with the physiology and anatomy of a human being, scientists or the R&D department of the company who made the equipment would have studied a human being's motor movements or different kind of muscular developments, that is called as trained diving. They are taught how to fall without breaking the bones. So the joints which could perform or show the characteristics or properties of both of gliding and angular movement is basically called as circumflexion. Flexion is that kind of an angular movement where you're bending at the joint of a part of the body in order to decrease the angular difference between that two parts of that limb. A body at rest will remain at rest, and a body in motion will remain in motion at the same speed and in the same direction unless acted on by an external force. Hello all, my name is Rohit. I take physical education on behalf of Prepschool by Vidhyaashram. In today's class, we will study about biomechanics and sports, where we'll study about biomechanics and its relevance in sports. And also we'll study the whole concept from the relevance and the angle of physical education. What is the significance of that? What is the relevance of that? Why do we need to study this? What is the whole idea behind teaching biomechanics or having biomechanics in physical education? Having said that, let's jump into the chapter overview and see what all things we will be studying in this particular chapter. So first we'll start off by defining biomechanics. So what is the meaning of biomechanics and what is the significance of that? After that we'll study about its importance. Like I said, we'll study about the significance of biomechanics in sports, and then we'll study about different types of movement, where we'll study about different kind of movements irrespective with biomechanics. We are talking about human movement, we are talking about athletes movement, what all anatomy is involved in there, what all kind of joints are involved in there, what all physiology is involved in there. All those things we'll be studying about different kind of movements and its properties. Then we'll study about Newton's law of motion and its application in sports. Now I want you to stress more on its application in sports rather than stressing more on Newton's law of motion, because I know when you focus on Newton's law of motion you may quite get bored saying that, sir, we have studied this million times in our life. We have been studying Newton's law of motion forever in all the subjects. We have studied this in environmental studies, we have studied this in physics, now we are studying this in PE. Why is this happening? Now understand this, Newton's law of motion is basic physics law which is applicable in every field. Thus you see this in every field. But understand this, in each field when you study about Newton's law of motion, you will be studying in respective to that particular field. So when you're talking about Newton's law of motion in sports or in physical education, we will be studying the same law but from the angle of physical education, or where all that law is involved when you talk about sports or different kind of physical activity. Having said that, let's start off with our first topic itself, that is defining biomechanics. Now before we get into the definition of biomechanics, it's important for you to normally know what do you mean by biomechanics as a layman, right? As a layman in general, what do you mean by biomechanics? Now I have always said this in class and in previous sessions also, whenever you don't understand a term, you split the term into two different parts and you will understand it better. Here we have the term called as biomechanics. So if you divide the biomechanics, you will get two terms over here, you will get two words over here, that is bio and mechanics. Bio, we are talking about the organic beings in the world. When you talk about bio, it is a short form or abbreviation for biology. Biology is what? It's a study of different organics or study of different organisms in the world. Then when we talk about biomechanics, we are talking about various mechanisms. We are talking about mechanism of this instrument, mechanism of that operation, mechanism of this, mechanism of different objects or different machines that are running around us. So all those things are called as mechanics. So when you combine these two terms together, that is bio and mechanics, you get a term called as biomechanics. By that division, by that breaking down of word itself would have given you the meaning of biomechanics. Biomechanics is what in that case? Biomechanics is the mechanism of organisms. Here we are talking about more specifically to human being because we are studying about sports. So the biomechanism, the mechanism of our body, the mechanism of our different angular movement, our pedestal movement, all those things, and the science of sports that we play, all together will fall under biomechanics. So the study of different movements that we do on our field in respective with the physiology and anatomy of a human being, that would be called as biomechanics in sports. Stress on the word in sports. Now in general, when you talk about biomechanics, lot of things will come under that and the area will become and the scope will become more wider. Here we are specifically scoping on physical education. Having said that, let's look into the definition of biomechanics now. So according to a scholar named Bartlett R, the study and analysis of human movement patterns in sports is called as biomechanism. So what is exactly biomechanism? Biomechanism is the study and analysis of human movement pattern. That means the motor patterns in a human being. It's a study of the motor patterns in a human being in sports is called as biomechanics. Now here stress on the word in sports. Now you may say, how could that be a biomechanics definition? Because here he has mentioned in sports. Isn't the same principle applicable when you talk about non-sports activity? Yes, but here this scholar Bartlett R has given this definition from the angle of sports. Thus that's why he has included the term or the phrase in sports in there. And having said that, and hoping you understood the definition and meaning of biomechanics and the breakdown of the word itself, let's move forward with our next topic, that is the importance of biomechanics. First, it assists in improving the technique. So whatever technique that you do on the field, every individual player has his own technique and skill. That gets improved if you understand about biomechanics and if you understand about the whole body. Next, it helps in improving equipment. Now you need to understand that whenever you go to gym, whenever you see different kind of exercise equipment, all of those equipments are made for human beings. That means the scientist or the R&D department of the company who made the equipment would have studied a human being's motor movements or different kind of muscular developments in order to come up with the design of the equipment. Now understanding in depth more about the biomechanics of the body will help the R&D department to create more advanced and more better equipment and training equipments. So that's the second point over here. It helps in improving equipment quality and equipment facility and the number of equipments in various different muscle categories. Okay. Next, it facilitates performance in sports. Obviously, when you know your body better, you perform better. So if you buy an equipment or any gadget, let's take an example of our general regular life. So when you buy a phone, you get a phone manual, right? So until unless you don't know in and out of your cell phone, until unless you don't read it properly, you will not be able to operate the phone very well, because every options and everything that is there in your phone is mentioned and the proper guide is given in the manual book. Exactly like that, you won't be able to make full utilization of your body if you don't know about your body. It's important for you to understand the physiology and anatomy of your body in order to make the full use of that or to push out the maximum potential that you have inside. Next, it supports in preventing injury. So if you know about biomechanics and if you know about your anatomy and if you know that certain bone will only move in a certain angle, beyond that if you push it, your bone may break or your joint may get dislocated. If you know that knowledge, then you will try not to fall in that direction which the bone is not supposed to mend. Or in case by any chance if you fall, you will try to fall safe. Okay. Now this may sound crazy, but it is important also for you to know how to fall without breaking your leg or breaking your muscles or bones. So that also is taught when you go for sports training. That is called as tactical diving. So if you might have seen in cricket, when bowlers catch during the fielding, they dive and they dive and then they slide without breaking their knee. How is that possible? That is called as trained diving. They are taught how to fall without breaking the bones. So that also it helps. It helps in again preventing any kind of injury because you know the body better. Next, it helps in promoting safety. Obviously what happens when you understand about the body structure and the way the motor ability of your body works and how different kind of anatomical components in your body is functioning, you will be able to play safe. So that's the fifth benefit of understanding and studying the biomechanics. Next, it works in improvements of training. So different kind of training techniques that you do are based on different kind of development that has done on the study and the research of biomechanics in a human being. So that also will improve along with the discoveries and more study about biomechanics. Next, it facilitates understanding of human body. Obviously that is understood point from the above point itself. Automatically when you study about that, human body's complexity, everybody has a different kind of complexity in the human being. You cannot study one person and apply the same principle on everybody because everybody's body's chemical activity and different physiological activity may differ depending on their genetics and the environment they are living in. So all those things will be balanced when you study more about human body and more about the biomechanics itself. Next, so assist in improving teaching and learning process. Now teaching and learning is a two-way process. So when I'm teaching, I need to have my concepts clear in order to explain you better. And also there should be a prerequisite knowledge that I should have in order to teach you better. Exactly like that. You as a student also should have a prerequisite library of vocabulary in your mind related to the subject that I'm teaching. Otherwise, whatever technical terms I use will go over your head and you will not understand that. So it's important for you to have that. But when you study about biomechanics, when we both on that side and this side, we both know about biomechanics, and then when I discuss something about biomechanics, it will be very easy for you to understand. So that's the whole concept. So if the student, if the trainer and the coach itself, if the player and the coach both knows about biomechanics and if they study about biomechanics and its importance in sports, what happens automatically, the teaching and the coaching process becomes much more easy and it becomes more smooth. So these were some of the importance and significance of biomechanics in sports. Now having said that, let's move forward with our next topic in this chapter, that is types of movement. So what all different kind of movements do we have? First we have gliding movement. Now before we get into each sub points or sub categories or sub type of movements in the body, we need to first understand, or we need to at least have a bird's eye view on the whole concept. The basic concept you should know. When you talk about movements, we have basically 5 different categories. Okay, fifth is obviously miscellaneous, but basically we have 4 categories, that is gliding movement, then you have angular movement, and then you have circumtension, and then you have rotation, and finally you have miscellaneous other movements. Okay, so when you talk about gliding movement is what? Gliding movement is that kind of a movement. It's basically, the naming itself is logically given. Gliding movement is that movement or that joint movement where at that point the bones are literally gliding over each other. For example, the ball socket. Okay, ball socket joint, basically my shoulder joint. When I'm moving my hand, automatically what is happening? My shoulder arm, my upper limb, the appendicular skeleton I'm talking about, that joint is moving along with the socket that I have on my shoulder. So it is gliding. So as I'm swinging my arms, that glide itself is moving, and that glide is happening. That's why it is called as gliding movement. Then you have angular movement. Angular movement is those kind of movements which has an extension or a movement up to a certain angle. It cannot go beyond that. Now take an example of the same shoulder that I was talking about. I can keep my hand here, or I can flex it over here, or I can move the hand over here. But can I bend my hand backwards? There's a limit I can go. And if somebody takes my hand and tries to pull back, what will happen? I will dislocate my arm joint, because my angular movement of that doesn't allow me for that kind of an extension. Angular movements are those movements which are limited to a certain angle. Okay, so certain joints will provide you only certain kind of angular movement, and certain other joints will provide you full circumferential movement. Okay, so that is called as angular movement. What is circumtension? Now circumtension is basically the hybrid of both gliding and angular movement. So the joints which could perform or show the characteristics or properties of both of gliding and angular movement is basically called as circumtension. So basically your hip joint, basically your hand joint. You might have noticed that I have used my same shoulder and same bone to show you the example of both gliding and angular movement. That itself is the best example for circumtension, because the shoulder joints itself shows the property of both angular and gliding movement, thus making it a circumtension movement. Okay, then you have the rotational movement. Now rotational movement is where your bone is able to rotate it properly on a ball socket. Okay, so when a movement is totally based on a rotation, okay, you are able to rotate the whole limb, or if you are able to rotate the whole hand without any kind of problem in a particular angle or in a particular direction, that is called as rotational movement. So if I do this, this is called as rotational movement. Yes, my shoulder has a limit, but my hand is able to take a whole circular motion or movement, that is called as again rotation over here. And then you have other movements which will again, you have hyperextension and dorsiflexion. But before getting into all of that other movements, let's go back to the angular movement and see what all things are there. When you talk about flexion, what do you mean by flexion? So what do you mean by flexion? Flexion is that kind of an angular movement where you are bending the parts at a joint. For example, I have my hand, so I am bending this hand over here. And what is the whole relevance and what is the whole idea and goal of that? When you are bending the hand, or when you are bending the whole part at a joint in order to decrease the angle between the two parts of the joint, that is called as flexion. So basically what is flexion? Flexion is that kind of an angular movement where you are bending at the joint of a part of the body in order to decrease the angular difference between that two parts of that limb. So for example, practically I will show you. This is my hand and there is two parts. We have this joint up to this shoulder one part, and this joint up to my hand one part. So if I bend from here, what will happen? The difference between this, the angular difference between that will decrease. When you are contracting the hand, when you are pulling back your hand at the joint point in order to decrease the angle between those two parts, that is called as flexion. Extension is what? Extension is basically opposite of that. When you're taking back the hand to increase the angle between the two parts, that becomes the extension. And what about the abduction and what about the adduction? What is the difference between that? Abduction is basically when you're trying to push away a body part or anything from its midline. So basically what is midline? Midline is basically the central part of our body. So if you divide the body into two different dissection, we have central part this. So my hand is over here, right? My hand is over here. So when I'm trying to lift my hand upwards, I'm trying to take my hand away from the midline. So when you're trying to take a limb or any body part away from the midline, that's called as abduction. And adduction is totally opposite to that. When I'm bringing my hand back to the space, back to its midline or closer to the midline, that is called as adduction. And after that, we have circumduction, which we already studied about. Then we studied about rotation. Then we have other movements. When we talk about other movements, we have hyperextension under miscellaneous movement, where hyperextension means you're trying to push a body part beyond its regular movement extension. So when I'm trying to look upwards, this is the maximum angle I could go, or this is the maximum angle where I could push my neck. And then I'm talking about moving right side or looking right side, this is the maximum I can go. But when you're pushing your head beyond its regular reach, that means this is my regular reach, and if I'm trying to go backwards and try to see back, that kind of movement is called as hyperextension. So I hope you understood practically what exactly the hyperextension means. Next is dorsiflexion. Okay, what do you mean by dorsiflexion? So when you talk about dorsiflexion is a kind of a movement where, for example, you have a feet and you are trying to bend the feet from the angular level, from the ankle level of your feet towards your chin. Okay, so this is your chin, this is your feet, and you're trying to lift from the front side towards your chin. So that's called as dorsiflexion. Then you have plantar flexion. Plantar flexion is the opposite to that, where you're trying to, where you're pushing the toe part downwards, making the central part or the ankle part push more frontwards. Okay, so that is called as plantar flexion. And then you have inversion. So when you talk about inversion is when you're turning your foot so that the sole of the foot faces medially. Okay, so that's called as inversion. So next that you have is called as protraction. So protraction. So protraction is basically what? Protraction is basically you are pushing a part forward. So basically, if this is my neck and if I'm trying to push my neck forward, that's called as protraction. Retraction is basically when I'm retracting my neck back to the normal center focus point. Okay, so there are a lot of type of opposite movements that we studied in the whole types of movements. That opposite itself help you to study this whole thing better, because you can write opposite to each other in front and then you can make a tabular list and you can study that. Okay, next is elevation. Elevation is basically what? Elevation is basically when you are lifting the body part up. For example, shrugging the shoulder. So when I'm lifting the shoulder upwards, that's called as elevation. At the same time, opposite of that is depression. When I'm putting my shoulder downwards, that is called as depression. So this is what? This is elevation, and this is what? This is depression. And next you have supination, where you're keeping your palms downwards when you're sleeping or when you're laying down. So when you're laying down, when you keep your palms downwards, that is called as supination. And opposite of that you have pronation, which is opposite to supination itself. That means in supination we kept the palm facing downwards, and in pronation we'll keep the palm facing upwards. Okay, next is eversion. Now eversion is basically totally opposite to inversion. So what is inversion? Let me give you a second. Can you recollect what is inversion? Inversion is basically, what is it? I'll give you a second. What is inversion? Inversion is turning your foot in a way that the sole faces medially. At the same time, it's opposite of eversion. In eversion, what happens? In eversion movement, what happens? You turn your feet in a way that the sole faces laterally. So there the sole is facing medially, here the sole is facing laterally. So this difference you have to keep in mind. So there are a lot of different kind of movements and opposite kind of movements you studied in types of movement itself. That itself will help you to, again, like I said, you can tabularize all the things and then you can study. That's one another tip that I would like to give you. Now here in today's session, I did a lot of practical by shrugging my shoulders and taking the chin forward and retracting back. I hope you guys are not making fun of me doing that. Having said that, and hoping you understood the whole different types of movements, let's move forward to our favorite part, that is the Newton's law of motion in sports, the application of that in sports. So what is the first Newton's law of motion? Now you already know this. What is it? Newton's first law of motion is law of inertia. We will jump into each one of them, but before that, let's list out first. The second law is law of acceleration, and the third law is law of reaction. So what does the first Newton's law of motion states? I could imagine you all shouting for the answer. So what is it? The first law is law of inertia. Okay, a body at rest will remain at rest, and a body in motion will remain in motion at the same speed and in the same direction unless acted on by an external force. So according to the first law of Newton, any object will remain in rest, or any matter will remain in rest or in motion unless an external force is being applied on that. So basically, if certain thing is on the move, or if something is kept stable, it will remain like that unless some external motion is applied on that. So that's the first Newton's law, which is also called as the law of inertia. Next you have the law of acceleration. What is the law of acceleration? Is the second law of motion, according to which a change in the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force producing it and inversely proportional to its mass. So what is the second law of motion? Second law of motion, also called as the law of acceleration. What does it state? It is the second law of motion, according to which a change in the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force producing it and inversely proportional to what? Inversely proportional to its mass. So what will happen according to this law is, if there are two objects and both of the objects have same mass and there is an external force being applied to both the object, but both the object is receiving different strength of external force, that means the external force applied on both the objects are different. That means in that case what will happen? The object on which the higher force is being applied will move more faster or will be pushed more faster than the object on which the lesser force is applied. And opposite to that also will happen conversely. How it will happen means, in the first case we took two objects of the same mass. In the second case we will take two objects of different masses, but the force that will be applied will be same. In the first case the force was different for both the objects, though the mass of the object was the same. But in this case both the mass of the object will be different but the force will be same. But since the law states that a change in the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force producing it and inversely proportional to the mass, what will happen in the second case is that, according to that, what will happen is that the object which has a lesser mass will be pushed more further compared to that object which has a higher mass, though the force being applied is the same. So that is what the law of acceleration states. So what is the law of acceleration? Once more, law of acceleration states that a change in the acceleration of an object, okay, a change in the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force producing it and inversely it is proportional to its mass, okay. So inversely it is proportional to its mass. So that is the law of acceleration. So we studied about two different laws. First is law of inertia, second is law of acceleration. Then we have the third law, that is law of reaction. Law of reaction states that, is the third law of motion. It states that according to that, for every action there is always an equal and opposite reaction. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So whatever you do, whichever kind of action you do, we are not talking philosophically over here. I want that to be clear in your head. So please don't talk, philosophically. We are talking more on a physics basis. So channelize your physics reasoning over here. So we are talking about physics here. So according to that, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, which is the third law of Newton. So let's jump into each one of them and see, take a different example and try to understand it better. So the first one, you have law of inertia. So the first law states that a body in rest will remain at rest, or a body in motion will remain in motion unless an external force is applied on that, okay. So let's take this law and apply it into physical education or sports. When you play football, if a football is kept on the field idle, it will remain like that, unless if a wind comes and tries to move it, or if some footballer comes and kicks the ball moves forward, right? So that serves as an example for law of inertia. Let's apply the same example in the statement of Newton and again try to reframe it. So the ball would have remained in rest, or the ball would have remained in motion if somebody did not apply an external force, right? So when you talk about the football, that was in the example that we are talking about, the ball was in the rest, the football was in the rest, unless somebody came and tried to hit it, okay. So footballer came and hit it, so it moved forward. So that external force by the footballer applied. Now you may say that, let's think about the opposite thing. There is one more component. We are not just talking about an object in rest, we are also talking about a condition of a object which could be in the motion and it will remain in motion unless an external force is not applied. So suddenly a pop-up will come in your mind saying that once the football was hit, it started traveling, it started moving, and after some time it stopped. Why is like that? Why is it like that? The law states that the body which is in motion will remain in motion unless an external force is applied on that. You may say that nobody tried to stop it or nobody stopped it. How come it stopped? Because when we talk about an external force in the law, we are not just talking about physically somebody going and touching it and stopping it. It could be a wind. It could also be a gravitational force. So gravitational force also is a factor that is involved in the law. So the external force that is being applied there is gravitational itself. That also is counted in the whole law, okay. So that's the first law of motion. That's the first law of motion, which is again called as law of inertia. Now second is the law of acceleration, which states that a change in the acceleration of an object is directly proportional to the force producing it and also inversely proportional to its mass. So we studied this earlier. We will not go much deep into that and take an example because we already took an example and studied this. Just to brush up your knowledge that you gained once more, let's take the same example of football over here too. Okay, so when a person is hitting the ball with a double speed, that means double power, the rate of acceleration of that ball also will be doubled. So let's take two instances over here. A footballer initially will try to hit a ball at normal speed. We could calculate its speed and its power and the acceleration of that. Then ask the same footballer to hit it with a double speed. You will see that the ball also accelerates with the double speed compared to the last time hit. Okay, so that itself is the law of acceleration by Newton, applied in sports and physical education. Having said that, let's move forward with our third law, that is the law of reaction. So what is the law of reaction? Law of reaction states that for every action there is always an equal and opposite reaction. So basically Newton's third law of motion states that there is an equal and opposite reaction for every action that you take. I kind of switched it in an inverted way, but it's the same thing. What is it? For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So basically whenever you try to walk, no, wait, let's take more simpler example. So whenever you try to jump on a trampoline, right, you bounce back, right, you bounce back in the air, but the height at which you'll get yourself bounced back will totally depend on how much hard you have jumped on that trampoline. So that itself states the third law of motion, that is the law of reaction. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The more harder you take a jump, the more higher you will go in trampoline. Now let's go back to the first example that I was trying to take, that is walking. So basically when you walk, what happens? You're trying to push back the ground as you keep the other leg forward. So every step you take, you're trying to push the ground backward. So ground also is applying the inverted reaction on your body, making you to walk forward. So the ground also is applying the equal reaction on your body, making you to walk forward. So that is another complicated yet simple example for the third law of motion, that is the law of reaction. With that, I hope you understood Newton's 3 different laws of motion, which you already knew about, but we studied it from the angle of sports. Now, I might have made you feel like you are in a physics class, but I assure you that if you see things from a sports angle, or if you see things from a physical education angle, all of this will make sense on the field or on the ground when you play the sports. Now, having that on the deck, I'll take an off from here. I'll see you in the next session with a fresh new chapter, with a fresh new concept. Until then, this is me Rohit, signing out. Until next time. Goodbye.